I get the house and the company, he just gets the tools. My name is Carl. I'm 32 and I just watched my sister Penelope announce my inheritance like she was reading a grocery list. The conference room at Henderson Law Offices felt smaller with every laugh that followed her words. My Uncle Wesley chuckled. My cousin Brooklyn nodded like she'd expected this all along. Even my Aunt Catherine smiled behind her coffee cup. Penelope sat across from me, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. She wore her best business suit, the navy one she'd bought for job interviews she never went to. Her marketing degree had been hanging on her wall for 8 years, but she'd spent most of that time planning what she'd do when my dad's construction business became hers. "Poor Carl," she said, glancing around the room. "Dad always said you were good with your hands. At least you'll have something to remember him by." The lawyer, Mr. Garrison, hadn't spoken yet. He sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents, his expression unreadable. I'd known him since I was 12. He'd handled every contract, every incorporation filing, every legal document for my dad's business. He knew things the family didn't. I stayed quiet. That's what I'd learned to do over the years. Let Penelope talk while I worked. She talked about expansion plans and new market opportunities at family dinners. I was the one who actually ran the crews, managed the contracts, and kept the clients happy. But today, sitting in that room, listening to her divide up my father's legacy like she was dealing cards, something felt different. The tools she mentioned so casually weren't just hammers and saws. They were precision equipment worth more than her car. The laser-guided surveying instruments, the custom fabrication machinery, the specialized concrete forms that had taken years to perfect, equipment that required licenses, certifications, and years of experience to operate properly. Penelope had visited the workshop exactly 3 times in the past 5 years. Each time she'd complained about the noise and dust. She'd never held a blueprint, never talked to a subcontractor, never spent a dawn-to-dusk day making sure a foundation was poured correctly. But the family saw her business suit and heard her confident voice discussing profit margins she'd learned about in textbooks. They saw my work clothes and assumed I was just another laborer who happened to share my dad's name. Mr. Garrison cleared his throat and opened the folder. Something in his expression made me sit straighter. After 30 years of legal practice, he'd developed a poker face that could hide anything. Today, though, I caught something in his eyes, a glimmer that looked almost like anticipation. My dad started Bennett Construction 22 years ago with a pickup truck and a borrowed tool set. I was 10 when I first helped him carry lumber. Penelope was 8 and more interested in her dolls than watching concrete cure. By the time I turned 18, I was running crews and reading blueprints. My dad enrolled me in business management classes at the community college. Nights and weekends I learned about contracts, liability insurance, and corporate structures. Penelope went to State University for marketing, convinced she'd return to revolutionize the family business with modern advertising techniques. While she was pledging sororities and studying consumer psychology, I was learning why you never skimp on rebar and how to bid commercial projects. My dad started bringing me to client meetings. I memorized building codes and developed relationships with suppliers. When Penelope graduated, she expected to step into a management position. Instead, she found a business that was running fine without her marketing expertise. "This company needs a social media presence," she'd announce at Sunday dinners. "We need to modernize our approach." My dad would nod politely while I explained which jobs we'd landed that week and which contracts were coming up for renewal. Real work. Tangible results. But Penelope's presentation skills made her sound more professional than my reports from the field. The warning signs had been there for months. Family members started asking Penelope about the business instead of me. She'd answer with confidence, describing expansion plans I'd never heard of, and market strategies that existed only in her imagination. She spoke about our clients like she knew them personally, though she'd met maybe 3 of them at company picnics. Last Christmas, she'd shown up with a business plan she'd written for the company's future. 47 pages of market analysis and growth projections. She'd presented it like she was unveiling the cure for cancer. The family had been impressed. I'd noticed she'd gotten our annual revenue wrong by nearly $500,000. 3 months ago, when my dad started getting sick, Penelope began talking about succession planning, She'd researched other construction companies that had transitioned to the next generation. She had spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd inherited something that already belonged to her. I never corrected her in front of the family. What was the point? They'd already decided who looked like a future business owner and who looked like hired help. Penelope's MBA classes had taught her to speak their language. My calloused hands and steel-toed boots told a different story. But late at night, when I was reviewing contracts and scheduling permits, I remembered something my dad had told me 6 years ago. Something about protecting the business from people who confused enthusiasm with competence. Something about making sure the right person was legally in control when the time came. The moment came during a family dinner 2 weeks after my dad's funeral. Penelope was describing her 5-year vision for Bennett Construction. New markets, corporate partnerships, a complete rebrand with professional logo design. "I've already contacted 3 potential investors," she said, cutting her steak with the precision of someone making an important point. "They're very interested in the company's growth potential." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "Investors for what?" "Expansion capital. We need to think bigger, Carl. Dad was too conservative. We could double our revenue within 3 years if we're smart about it." The family nodded along. Wesley mentioned how proud my dad would be to see his business growing. Brooklyn talked about modern construction techniques she'd read about online. Catherine suggested Penelope should write a book about family business transitions. That's when I realized they'd all convinced themselves of something that wasn't true. They'd created a version of reality where Penelope was the natural heir to a construction empire, and I was the loyal employee who'd stick around to handle the dirty work. I excused myself early and drove to the office. The building was dark, but I had keys to everything. I went to the filing cabinet where my dad kept the corporate documents. Everything was there, exactly as I remembered. Articles of incorporation filed 6 years ago, stock certificates, board resolutions. My name was on everything that mattered. The business had never been in my dad's name alone. It had been incorporated as Bennett Construction Incorporated, with specific ownership structures designed to protect it from inheritance taxes and family disputes. I owned 75% of the stock. I was listed as president and chief executive officer. My dad had structured it that way the year Penelope graduated college, right around the time she started talking about modernizing the business without understanding how it actually worked. I sat in that office until midnight, reading through 6 years of corporate filings. Every major contract had been signed with my name and title. Every insurance policy listed me as the primary contact. The business banking accounts required my signature for anything over $500. Penelope didn't even have check-signing privileges, but she didn't know any of this. None of them did. My dad had handled the legal paperwork quietly, probably hoping he'd have more time to explain the arrangement to the family gradually. Instead, cancer had moved faster than his plans for gentle revelations. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. For 6 years I'd been running a company I legally owned, while my family assumed I was just the reliable worker who'd inherited some tools. Tomorrow, at the reading of the will, Mr. Garrison would have some interesting news to share. I found myself looking forward to the meeting in a way that surprised me. The will reading was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I arrived early and took a seat facing the door. Penelope entered like she was walking into her own boardroom, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing confidence like expensive perfume. The rest of the family filed in behind her, settling into their chairs with the satisfied air of people about to witness something they'd expected all along. "Before we begin," Penelope announced, "I want everyone to know that I'm committed to honoring Dad's legacy. Bennett Construction will continue to serve this community with integrity and excellence." Wesley beamed at her like she'd just delivered the Gettysburg Address. "Your father would be so proud, sweetheart." "Carl will always have a place with the company, of course," she continued, glancing at me with what she probably thought was gracious magnanimity. "His experience and skills are valuable assets. I'm hoping he'll consider staying on as operations manager." Operations manager of a company I already owned and operated. Mr. Garrison had been shuffling papers throughout Penelope's speech, his expression professionally neutral. Now he looked up and adjusted his glasses. "Shall we begin with the formal reading?" he asked. The will itself was straightforward. Penelope inherited the house on Maple Street, along with its contents and the attached 3-car garage. There were smaller bequests to other family members. Wesley got my dad's fishing boat. Catherine received his collection of vintage tools. Brooklyn inherited a small cash bequest and some jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. And to my son Carl, Mr. Garrison read, "I leave my complete set of professional tools, machinery, and equipment, along with any vehicles used in the operation of Bennett Construction." Penelope smiled indulgently. The family exchanged glances that said they'd expected exactly this division of assets. The daughter got the real inheritance. The son got the worker's tools. "That's it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That's the extent of the will," Mr. Garrison confirmed. Penelope leaned back in her chair, already mentally rearranging the office furniture. "Well, I think Dad made his intentions pretty clear. Carl gets the tools he knows how to use, and I get the responsibility of running the actual business." "About that," Mr. Garrison said quietly. Something in his tone made everyone stop talking. "There's something we need to discuss regarding Bennett Construction." He pulled out a different set of documents. The business entity itself wasn't part of Mr. Bennett's estate to bequeath. Penelope's smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "Bennett Construction has been a corporation for 6 years. It's owned by shareholders, not by individuals who can pass it along through a will." The room went very quiet. Wesley shifted in his seat. Catherine set down her coffee cup. Brooklyn looked confused. "I don't understand," Penelope said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Of course Dad owned the business. His name was on everything. The business operates under the corporate name," Mr. Garrison explained patiently. "But the actual ownership is determined by stock certificates issued when the company was incorporated." I watched Penelope's face as understanding began to creep in. She wasn't stupid. She'd taken enough business classes to know what corporate structure meant, but she'd never thought to ask about the specific legal arrangement of our family business. "Who owns the stock?" she asked, though I could see she was beginning to suspect the answer. Mr. Garrison consulted his documents. According to the corporate filings, Carl Bennett holds 75% of outstanding shares. He's also listed as the corporation's president and chief executive officer. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This one had weight to it like the moment before a thunderclap. Penelope stared at the documents as if they might change their contents under her gaze. "That's impossible. Carl doesn't even have a business degree." "The incorporation papers are quite clear," Mr. Garrison said, spreading them across the table. "Bennett Construction Incorporated was established 6 years ago with specific ownership structures designed to ensure business continuity and operational control." I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. Wesley looked like he'd been told Santa Claus was a tax auditor. Catherine was reading over the documents with the intensity of someone decoding ancient hieroglyphics. Brooklyn appeared to be questioning everything she'd ever understood about family dynamics. "But I've been planning the company's future," Penelope said, her voice smaller now. "I've been developing strategies, talking to potential clients, researching expansion opportunities." "With what authority?" I asked quietly. She turned to me with something approaching desperation. "Carl, you know Dad wanted me involved in the business. He always talked about keeping it in the family. He did keep it in the family. He put it in my name." Mr. Garrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should explain the timeline. The incorporation took place shortly after Miss Penelope graduated from college. At that time, Carl had been working in the business for several years and had completed his business management certification. That was the detail Penelope had never bothered to learn. While she was studying marketing theory and consumer psychology, I'd been earning actual business credentials. Project management certification, construction business law, financial planning for small corporations. My dad had insisted on it. The corporate structure was designed to reflect actual operational responsibility, Mr. Garrison continued. Carl had been managing contracts, overseeing crews, and handling client relationships. The legal ownership follows the practical management structure that was already in place. Wesley finally found his voice. You mean Carl has been running the company this whole time? He's been the legal president for 6 years, Mr. Garrison confirmed. All major contracts have been executed under his authority. He's the primary signatory on business accounts and insurance policies. I pulled out my business cards and distributed them around the table. Carl Bennett, President, Bennett Construction Incorporated. I'd been carrying them for 6 years, but the family had never bothered to read the title carefully. The tools mentioned in the will, Mr. Garrison added, include specialized equipment worth approximately $150,000. This equipment is essential to the corporation's operations and remains under Carl's control as both inheritance and business assets. Penelope was doing math in her head, and I could see her reaching uncomfortable conclusions. What about the contracts I was discussing with potential clients? What contracts? I asked. The Henderson Shopping Center project, the municipal building renovation, the residential development on Oak Street. Those are all jobs we're already doing, I said. Henderson's been our client for 3 years. The municipal contract was signed last month. The Oak Street development is scheduled to break ground next week. She'd been taking credit for my work without realizing it. The impressive client roster she'd been discussing with family members wasn't her vision for the company's future. It was the company's present reality. The room felt smaller with each revelation. My inheritance hadn't been the consolation prize of a few tools and a handshake. My inheritance had been confirmed ownership of a successful business I'd already been running. The meeting ended with Penelope requesting copies of all corporate documents and my family promising to discuss everything over dinner that weekend. I drove back to the job site on Oak Street, where my crew was pouring foundation footers for a 12-unit housing development worth $800,000. My foreman, Vincent, met me at the trailer. How did the lawyer meeting go? About like I expected. He nodded. Vincent had worked for my dad for 15 years. He knew who actually ran the company, regardless of what the family thought. Your sister still planning to modernize our operations? She's going to have some adjustments to make. That evening, Penelope called me 3 times. I let the calls go to voicemail. Her messages progressed from confused to frustrated to demanding explanations I didn't owe her. The 4th call came at 11 p.m. Carl, we need to talk. About what? About this corporate structure thing. There has to be some mistake. No mistake. But I've been telling people I'm taking over the business. I've made commitments based on inheriting the company. That was her problem, not mine. What kind of commitments? I may have mentioned to some potential investors that I would be in a position to make decisions about expansion funding. I sat up straighter. What investors? Just some people I met through networking events. They're interested in construction companies with growth potential. Penelope, you don't have authority to discuss business investments with anyone. I thought I would after the will reading. Well, now you know different. The silence stretched between us. Finally, she asked, what happens now? Now you figure out what you actually want to do with your life. I hung up and went back to reviewing the next day's work schedules. The Henderson project needed materials delivered by 7 a.m. The municipal building renovation required a progress inspection Thursday morning. The Oak Street development had a concrete delivery scheduled for Friday. Real work. Real deadlines. Real responsibilities that wouldn't wait for family drama to resolve itself. The next morning, I found Penelope waiting by my truck when I arrived at the office. She looked like she hadn't slept. I need to understand something, she said without preamble. Have you been planning this? Planning what? This whole corporate ownership thing. Did you and Dad set this up to cut me out? I unlocked the office door and let her follow me inside. The walls were covered with project photos, client contracts, and safety certifications. 6 years of work she'd never bothered to notice. Dad set it up to protect the business, I said, starting the coffee maker. From people who might confuse good intentions with actual competence. That's not fair. Fair would have been you asking about the business structure before announcing you were taking it over. She stood in the middle of the office, looking around like she'd never seen it before. In many ways, she hadn't. She'd visited maybe a dozen times in 6 years, usually to borrow something or deliver messages from family members. So what am I supposed to do now? Whatever you want, just not with my company. My phone rang. Henderson Development with a question about material specifications for their next project. While I talked through the technical details, Penelope wandered around the office, finally seeing the evidence of 6 years of work she'd been planning to inherit. When I finished the call, she was reading a client testimonial letter hanging next to my business license. "They all know you," she said quietly. "They should. I've been doing business with them for years." She left without saying goodbye. The confrontation I'd been expecting came 2 weeks later at my Uncle Wesley's birthday party. The family had gathered at his house for dinner, and the conversation inevitably turned to Bennett Construction's future. Penelope had spent 2 weeks researching corporate law and consulting with business advisors. She arrived at the party armed with legal terminology and righteous indignation. "I've been consulting with attorneys," she announced over dessert. "There are legal remedies for situations like this: minority shareholder rights, fiduciary duty violations, breach of family trust." Wesley nodded supportively. "That's the spirit, sweetheart. Don't let anyone take advantage of you." Catherine chimed in. "Your father never would have wanted the family business to cause division between his children. They'd convinced themselves that I'd somehow manipulated the situation, that the corporate structure was a recent development designed to cheat Penelope out of her rightful inheritance. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. They'd never bothered to understand how the business actually worked. "I'm prepared to challenge the corporate arrangements in court if necessary," Penelope continued, looking directly at me. "Family businesses have certain obligations to all family members." I set down my coffee cup and pulled out my phone. "Before you hire more lawyers, there's something you should see." I showed her the screen. Bennett Construction's latest contract, signed the previous Friday. Municipal water treatment plant expansion, $2.3 million scheduled to begin next month. "This is what Dad built," I said quietly. Not the idea of a construction company. Not the potential for a construction company. The actual construction company that employs 12 full-time workers and generates over $4 million in annual revenue. Penelope stared at the contract amount. $4 million? Last year's gross revenue. This year we're tracking toward $5.2 million. The number hung in the air like an unwelcome truth. Penelope's inheritance assumptions had been based on a much smaller business, something she could learn to manage through enthusiasm and good intentions. The reality was a complex operation requiring specialized knowledge, established relationships, and years of experience she didn't possess. "The corporate structure wasn't designed to keep you out," I continued. "It was designed to keep the business running when Dad couldn't anymore." Penelope never filed any legal challenges. Her attorney apparently explained that corporate ownership structures established 6 years earlier, with clear documentation and legitimate business purposes, weren't something you could overturn through family grievance proceedings. She moved to Denver 3 months later, taking a marketing position with a tech startup. At Christmas dinner, she was careful to ask about the business, rather than making assumptions about it. We'd found a way to be siblings again, though the dynamic was permanently different. Wesley still occasionally suggested that I should consider bringing Penelope back into the company as a partner, but his suggestions carried less conviction now. The business results spoke louder than family politics. Catherine made fewer comments about modernization and marketing strategies. Brooklyn developed a genuine interest in construction management and started asking practical questions about project scheduling and client relations. The family had learned to distinguish between appearing successful and being successful. Penelope's confident presentations had impressed them because they sounded professional. My work had been invisible to them because it happened in the field, with clients they'd never met, solving problems they'd never considered. Bennett Construction expanded into commercial roofing the following year. We hired 6 additional workers and opened a satellite office in the next county. The business that Penelope had wanted to inherit for its potential became something larger under the management of someone who understood both its limitations and its possibilities. In the end, The inheritance had revealed something my dad probably knew but never had the chance to explain directly. Ownership isn't about family birthright or good intentions. It's about competence, commitment, and the willingness to take responsibility for consequences that extend beyond yourself. The tools I inherited weren't just equipment. They were the means to build something that would last, and that's exactly what I did.